The mid-1970s, a time known for shag carpet, wood paneling, and pet rocks, when a certain shark terrified us so much we didn't want to go back into the water. The Watergate scandal had just wrapped up with the new presidency, and the Vietnam War had just ended. Consumer technology was in its infancy, and for the first time in history, a generation of kids were playing video games, either at home or at the arcade. Then, a new market emerged.
The portable gaming market, turning a simple concept into a billion-dollar industry. Let's take a look at the history of 3 decades of portable electronic gaming.
By the mid-1970s, Mattel was already a giant in the toy industry. Barbie and Hot Wheels had made it a household name. But something was changing. Calculators were shrinking, digital watches were becoming affordable, and electronics were entering everyday life. Mattel saw an opportunity. It created Mattel Electronics, a division focused on combining toys with emerging technology. The goal was simple: make electronic games small enough to hold in your hand. The problem was the display. LCD screens weren't ready yet. The technology just wasn't there. So engineers turned to a simpler solution: LEDs. Instead of moving images, the games used fixed lights that switched on and off rapidly, creating the illusion of movement. And this simple idea became Auto Race in 1976. You controlled a small blinking car dodging traffic to survive as long as possible. The game had no animation, no sprites, or anything that you would relate to a video game today. The game itself wasn't a massive hit, but it did show proof of concept. Portable electronic gaming worked, and Mattel immediately began working on its next idea. Football was the obvious choice. The sport was just exploding in popularity in the mid-1970s, and Mattel believed it could translate well into a handheld format. Like Auto Race, it used fixed red LEDs. Players and defenders were just lights. Movement was an illusion created by switching LEDs on and off in sequence. You controlled the ball carrier, and the goal was simple: reach the end zone and score a touchdown. It was easy to learn, but hard to master. The game could be played in either one-player or two-player format. In one player, you would play against yourself, trying to outscore yourself. In two-player format, 2 players could play in the offensive position, trying to outscore each other. And electronic football? Well, it almost worked too well. During the 1977 holiday season, football became a runaway success. Stores sold out, demand outpaced supply, and it became a must-have toy. And more importantly, it changed the industry overnight. Now, Mattel didn't just make a hit game, it created a whole new market. And competitors, they were starting to take notice. After electronic football, Mattel expanded fast. Instead of relying on one product, it built a full lineup. Baseball, basketball, hockey, soccer, bowling, you name it. And each game reused the same core idea: simple controls, LED-based movements, and fast gameplay built around head-to-head competition trying to beat your opponent. And the formula worked. Parents who bought one game often came back for another. Retailers pushed the growing lineup. But Mattel didn't stop just at sports. It experimented with arcade-style games like Subchase and Starhawk, and it released board game adaptations like computer chess and backgammon. It even tried novelty electronics and experimental titles. Mattel wasn't just selling games anymore, it was building an electronic toy ecosystem. But LED technology was pretty simple and had its limits. So Mattel pushed forward. First came the VFD displays, or vacuum fluorescent displays. These added color and more detailed visuals, bringing handheld games closer to arcade experiences. Games like Starhawk and Space Battle felt more dramatic and immersive. Sports titles like World Championship Football and Baseball added visual depth without losing portability. But VFDs weren't the only step forward. A real shift came with LCD technology. LCDs used far less power and allowed more detailed artwork while dramatically extending battery life. This opened the door for a new generation of games, such as Armor Attack, Speed Freak, Burger Time, Dungeons and Dragons, and Masters of the Universe. Handheld gaming was no longer just blinking lights, it was becoming miniature worlds. Not every Mattel Electronics product was a game in the traditional sense. Some were basically just experiments. Computer Chess tried to simulate strategy gameplay. Brain Baffler tested logic and memory. Diet Track tracked calories. Horoscope Computer generated daily readings of your horoscope. Even the Bee Gees had a licensed product called the Bee Gees Rhythm Machine that turned music into gameplay. Some of these ideas succeeded and many of them didn't. But together they showed a company experimenting freely with what electronics could do. Mattel wasn't following the portable formula yet, it was still inventing it. Now, success rarely stays unchallenged. Coleco, Entex, Milton Bradley, and Parker Brothers all entered the handheld market. Each brought a new design, licenses, and technology improvements. And then came Nintendo. In 1980, Nintendo launched the Game & Watch. It used LCD technology, compact designs, and highly efficient gameplay. The idea was familiar. A portable electronic game, simple, addictive, and it was just everywhere. The market that Mattel had helped create was now crowded with competitors. And for the first time, Mattel was no longer at the top. While handhelds continued, Mattel Electronics shifted its focus to a new project, the Intellivision, a home console designed to compete with the Atari 2600. It quickly became the company's priority. Resources, marketing, and engineering talent shifted towards the living room. The handheld division slowed, and then came 1983, the video game crash. Sales collapsed across the industry as retailers cut orders and inventory piled up. Mattel Electronics lost hundreds of millions of dollars. By 1984, the division was shut down. One of the earliest pioneers of the handheld gaming market was now gone. Today, Mattel's handheld games look pretty simple. The red lights and sound and the plastic shells all powered by a 9-volt battery. But really, they did change everything. Auto Race proved that portable gaming was possible. Electronic football proved that it could be a hit and be successful. And everything that followed proved that it could evolve rapidly. To understand why Tomy's handhelds became so legendary, we first have to look at the landscape before they arrived. In the mid-1970s, electronic gaming was still in its absolute infancy. Home consoles like Atari's Pong had only recently introduced families to the concept of controlling video games on their TV. Even then, dedicated consoles were viewed by many parents as expensive, fleeting novelties rather than household essentials. Meanwhile, the arcades were just exploding. Titles like Breakout, Gunfight, and eventually Space Invaders were drawing crowds unlike anything the world had ever seen. For kids in the 1970s, walking into an arcade felt like stepping into the future. The flashing lights, the synthesized sounds, and the vibrant cabinet art. It was just a sensory overload that simply could not be recreated at home. And naturally, toy manufacturers wanted a piece of that hype. Industry giants like Mattel Electronics began experimenting with handheld sports games, proving that there was a massive, ravenous appetite for portable entertainment. Their success sent a loud, clear message to the rest of the toy industry. Kids didn't just want electronic toys, they wanted to take the arcade with them. Now, Tomy was paying very close attention. Founded in Japan in 1924, Tomy had spent decades building a stellar reputation for producing toys. They weren't born out of the Silicon Valley boom. Their expertise laid in mechanical ingenuity, hands-on gameplay, and clever tactile design. And as it turned out, those exact strengths would become the defining features for their electronic gaming division. And it all started with deceptively simple mechanical toys, like Drive Yourself Crazy. With the success of the mechanical toys, Tomy wanted to get into the electronic gaming industry. They weren't trying to compete with Atari in the home, and they weren't trying to replace the arcade either. Instead, they asked a much more practical question. How do we give kids something to play with when there isn't a television around? Remember, this was years before the Game Boy, years before the Sega Game Gear, and even before Nintendo's own Game & Watch series had hit the market. Profitable electronic gaming was still the Wild West, and every toy company had a different blueprint of what the future would look like. And for Tomy, that future began with a blip. If you never held a Tomy blip in person, it's almost impossible to appreciate how bizarre this thing is. Nothing about it screams cutting-edge video game technology. And then, what did you do to play it? You had to wind it up, like a watch. And your job as the player is to push the corresponding button to return the ball before it slips past you. That's it, just one little moving light, and yet, it was absolutely addictive. The brilliant secret of Blip was that it wasn't an actual electronic game in the modern sense. The vast majority of the magic was happening purely through mechanical gears. The battery-powered LED simply enhanced the illusion. It was classic Tomy engineering overcoming the high cost of microprocessors with pure design brilliance. It was more than just another Pong clone, and it's easy to look back at Blip today and dismiss it as primitive. But that's judging history through modern eyes. I mean, picture yourself in the backseat of a 1970s station wagon on a grueling family road trip. No smartphones, no iPads, no built-in DVD players. If you were lucky, you had a comic book, but if you were really lucky, you had Blip. Suddenly, those endless miles got a little shorter. Tomy quickly proved that they weren't interested in following the pack. While Mattel doubled down on sports simulations and other brands chased expensive arcade licenses, Tomy leaned entirely into quirky, original concepts. By 1978, encouraged by Blip's massive success, they expanded their horizons.
They launched Digital Diamond, which brought handheld baseball to the masses.
And Digital Daredevil, a game that challenged players with split-second timing and mechanical dexterity. They were colorful and built to survive being aggressively tossed into a toy box. And because they were built like tanks, collectors could still easily find fully functional units nearly 50 years later. But as the 1970s drew to a close, the entire gaming industry changed overnight. Video games evolved into a multi-billion-dollar phenomenon. The race was no longer about making clever electronic toys. It was about bringing the arcade to the home. Tomy knew mechanical tricks could only take them so far. To compete in the dawn of the 1980s, they needed a new weapon, a technology that glowed brighter than standard LEDs. That technology was the vacuum fluorescent display, and it was about to kickstart Tomy's golden age. Instead of isolated dots, VFDs utilized bright, multicolored phosphor shapes that appeared to float across the pitch-black void. Vibrant greens, intense oranges, and cool electronic blues could all occupy the screen at the same time. If you turned off the bedroom lights, the Tomy tabletop instantly transformed your desk into a miniature, glowing neon arcade. In 1981, there was one arcade title every single toy manufacturer was desperate to license: Pac-Man. It wasn't just a popular game, it was a global obsession. Tomy secured the rights and delivered a tabletop version that immediately turned heads. Molded in bright, iconic yellow plastic, the cabinet looked like a cross between a miniature arcade machine and a science fiction prop. When you first fired it up, you were greeted by a glowing maze, distinctively colored ghost, and a surprisingly expressive Pac-Man. Was it arcade perfect? No, but it captured the soul of the arcade. Today, it remains one of Tomy's most iconic creations. Now, if there was a single movie property perfectly tailored for the VFD technology, it was Disney's 1982 sci-fi epic Tron. Its neon cyber landscapes translated flawlessly into Tomy's fluorescent displays, creating a remarkably atmospheric experience despite the straightforward, reflex-driven gameplay. But Tomy wasn't just chasing Hollywood blockbusters. In the exact same year, they released Caveman. Instead of spaceships or sports, you were navigating a colorful prehistoric world dodging dinosaurs. But the industry was moving at a breakneck speed. Nintendo was rapidly capturing the ultra-portable market with their slim Game & Watch line, while Coleco was launching their own line of heavy-hitting arcade tabletops. Tomy realized that, to stay ahead, they couldn't just keep making the same style of cabinets. They needed a concept so bold, so radically different, that it would completely redefine how players interacted with a handheld game. They didn't want you to just look at a screen anymore. They wanted you to look inside another dimension. By 1983, the electronic handheld market was cannibalizing itself. The novelty of simple handheld tech had worn off, and store shelves were completely oversaturated. If you wanted to capture the imagination of a kid in 1983, you had to pull off some kind of miracle. Tomy's response? The Tomytronic 3D. The first time kids saw this device, they had absolutely no clue what they were looking at. Decades before the Virtual Boy or modern VR headsets, this humble plastic toy was trying to convince kids they were looking directly into a three-dimensional digital universe. The wizardry inside of the Tomytronic 3D was brilliantly elegant, with each eye viewing a slightly offset image through a precise configuration of internal mirrors and lenses. Your brain did the heavy lifting, fusing the two images together to create the sensation of true three-dimensional space. But for the few that actually did own it, Games like Planet Xeon were unforgettable. Space shooters were the definitive genre of the era, and Planet Xeon added a whole new layer of tension. Enemy ships didn't just move left and right, they aggressively scaled up from the depths of the screen, hurtling straight toward your face. Tomy rolled out various LCD games. While it was a smart business move, the standalone electronic handheld was slowly losing its unique identity, becoming more of a promotional merchandise piece than a cutting-edge technology toy. And then came 1989, the year the floor fell out from underneath the dedicated handheld market. Nintendo had released the Game Boy. The Game Boy wasn't a powerhouse on paper. It had a monochrome, non-backlit green screen and a modest processor. By the early 1990s, the golden era of the standalone electronic handheld was over. Tomy, Mattel, Entex, and Bandai all had to face a new reality of the market. The cartridge had won. Tomy didn't vanish, of course. They remained a massive, incredibly successful toy titan to this day.
The story of Simon starts in 1976 when engineers Ralph Baer, the father of video games and the designer of the Magnavox Odyssey, and Howard Morrison were at the Music Operators of America trade show in 1976. There they saw Atari's Touch Me arcade game that was released in 1974. Touch Me was a game of copying patterns the computer was generating on a button panel. It had 4 colored buttons that would start lighting up, starting with 1 and adding 1 more color to the sequence each time the player got it right, also adding to their score. It would continue until the player got the sequence wrong and the game would end. It was made to compete with the pinball machines of the time, as it did not have a screen and joysticks, like a majority of the arcade games that were coming out. This game was not a success for Atari, but did sell a few units. Baer and Morrison saw this machine and thought the idea was good, but thought the execution of the game was horrible. In fact, Baer was quoted as saying, "Nice gameplay, terrible execution, visibly boring, miserable, rasping sounds." It was at this time that they thought that they could come up with a consumer product, a portable version of this game, made smaller and better than what Atari was offering in the arcades. By 1977, Baer had created a prototype of the game using the Texas Instruments TMS 1000 microcontroller and named it Follow Me. One of Baer's associates, Lenny Cope, programmed the source code for the microcontroller. They made the game so small that it fit into an 8-inch by 8-inch console. It was pitched to Milton Bradley, and they agreed to distribute it. It first debuted in 1978, get this, at Studio 54. You know, the infamous celebrity party palace in New York in the 70s and 80s, and was a massive hit there with the patrons. After the successful outing at Studio 54, Milton Bradley started distributing it to consumer stores. Debuting at a price of $24.95, it was a huge hit during the 1978 Christmas shopping season. It was so successful that in the following couple years, 2 new Simon games were released. Pocket Simon, an even smaller version of the game that could fit in most pockets. Also Super Simon was released, giving it more games to play and introducing multiple players for head-to-head competition. Milton Bradley was acquired by Hasbro in 1984 and continued to produce Simon.
The story of Parker Brothers begins almost 100 years before the company would ever create an electronic game. In 1883, George S. Parker founded Parker Brothers in Salem, Massachusetts. At the time, many board games were designed around teaching lessons, improving skills, and reinforcing certain ideas. Parker believed that games should have a different purpose. They should be fun. And that simple philosophy became the foundation of the company. Parker Brothers quickly built a reputation for creating games that were easy to understand, enjoyable for families, and capable of bringing people together. Then came a game that would define the company forever. That was Monopoly. Introduced in 1935, Monopoly became one of the most successful board games in history. Its simple concept of buying properties, collecting rent, and trying to bankrupt your opponent turned into a worldwide phenomenon. But Monopoly was only one part of Parker Brothers' success. The company followed with other legendary titles such as Clue, Risk, Sorry, and many, many more. By the end of the 1960s and early 1970s, Parker Brothers had become one of the most recognizable toy and game companies in America. But the 1970s brought a major shift in the toy industry. The future of gaming was becoming electronic. During the early 1970s, computers were still enormous machines, mostly used by businesses, universities, and government organizations. But advances in semiconductor technology were changing all that. Engineers were discovering ways to make processors smaller and cheaper. One of the first companies to recognize the potential was Mattel Electronics. In 1976, Mattel released Auto Race, one of the first successful handheld electronic games. Then came Mattel's Electronic Football, which became a massive success. Suddenly, millions of children were experiencing something that felt futuristic. They were no longer just playing with a toy, they were interacting with a computer. Then Milton Bradley entered the market with Simon in 1978, a game that combined lights and sound with memory challenges. Simon became a cultural phenomenon and showed that electronic games could appeal to everyone, not just the traditional gamer. The message was clear: electronic entertainment was the next big thing. When Parker Brothers entered the electronic gaming market, they knew they needed something that would stand apart from the rest of the competition. Released in 1978, Merlin became one of the most successful electronic games of its generation, and remains one of the most recognizable handheld electronic toys ever created. But what made Merlin so special wasn't just the technology inside, it was the idea behind it. At a time when most electronic games were designed around a single concept, Merlin offered multiple experiences in one device. It had 6 different games inside one handheld unit, and for a child growing up in 1978, that was just amazing. Merlin was created by inventors Tom Doyle, Holly Doyle, and Wendell Thomas. The design was unlike anything else on store shelves. Instead of using a traditional display, Merlin featured 11 red LEDs arranged across the front of the unit. Each light served as a button. This created a unique combination of input and output. Inside the plastic shell was a Texas Instruments TMS 1000 microcontroller. It combined processing power, memory, and input controls into a single chip, allowing manufacturers to create electronic devices that were smaller and more affordable. One of Merlin's biggest selling points was the variety of games included. Players could choose from 6 different experiences. The first was tic-tac-toe. Another game was Music Machine. This allowed players to create simple melodies by pressing the buttons on Merlin. Merlin also included a game called Echo, a memory game where players had to repeat increasingly complex patterns of lights. This type of gameplay became extremely popular during the era, especially after the success of Simon. Another game was Blackjack 13, and it brought the card game into the electronic world. Players attempted to reach 13 without going over. Then there was Magic Square that challenged players with number puzzles, while Mindbender tested logic and problem-solving skills. More than 5 million units were sold during its lifetime, making Merlin one of the best-selling electronic games of its era. For Parker Brothers, this was a huge victory. Following the success of the original Merlin, Parker Brothers released Master Merlin in 1980. The concept was simple: take the original Merlin formula and expand it. Master Merlin was essentially one of the earliest examples of an electronic game sequel. However, the market was changing quickly. By 1980, consumers were being introduced to arcade hits. Parker Brothers recognized this change and began experimenting with different types of gameplay. One example of this new direction was Split Second. Released in 1980, Split Second focused on speed and reaction time rather than strategy. The goal was simple: react faster than the machine. At first glance, Split Second may seem extremely basic compared to modern games, but during this era, simplicity was part of the appeal. Another awesome game from Parker Brothers was Wildfire. Released in 1979, unlike many electronic games at the time, Wildfire wasn't based on sports. Instead, it put a small electronic pinball machine in your hands. The players had to react quickly to the red LED pinball that bounced around. While Parker Brothers was releasing handheld electronic games, the entertainment industry was undergoing another major transformation. The Atari 2600 had become a huge success. Arcades were exploding in popularity, and consumers were beginning to expect more from electronic entertainment. The company that once had dominated the board game industry was about to enter the video game war. During the early 1980s, Parker Brothers became one of the largest third-party video game publishers in the industry, and one of their biggest successes was Frogger. Originally created by Konami and released in the arcades in 1981, Frogger became one of the most recognizable arcade games of its generation. Parker Brothers recognized the game's potential and secured the rights to bring it into homes. The company released Frogger for a wide variety of systems, including the Atari 2600, the 5200, the ColecoVision, the Intellivision, and several home computer systems. At the time, bringing the arcade home was a major selling point. Another major arcade license Parker Brothers acquired was Cougar. Released by Gottlieb in 1982, Cougar was unlike anything else in the arcades. The game was visibly unique and immediately recognizable. That made it a perfect candidate for a home conversion and also for a tabletop. Players could now enjoy Cougar without leaving the house, and if you did, you could take it along with you. This was the entire promise of the early video game market. The arcade was now in the palm of your hands. Parker Brothers went on to create several more video games released on home consoles, such as Popeye, Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back, Star Wars Jedi Arena, James Bond 007, and Montezuma's Revenge. It was an impressive expansion, but the timing was about to become a problem. By 1983, the home video game market collapsed, at least in North America. Companies that seemed unstoppable only a year earlier were suddenly struggling. Atari suffered enormous losses. Many smaller publishers disappeared completely, and companies like Parker Brothers were forced to reconsider their place in the gaming world. The Parker Brothers name continued appearing in classic products, but the company's ambitious push toward electronic gaming had largely just come to an end. In 1991, Parker Brothers became part of Hasbro.
In the mid-1970s, video games in general were still a new phenomenon. For most people, video games meant a Pong console connected to their TV at home, or you could venture outside the house to the arcade and play the latest greatest video games available. With arcade games really showcasing how fast video game technology was advancing. But there was also another electronic device that was advancing rapidly, and that was the calculator. By the mid-1970s, semiconductor technology had improved, and chips were getting smaller, more powerful, and most importantly, cheaper. This is when companies started to realize that these same chips could be used to make games. This was the first wave of true electronic games that started to replace electromechanical games such as Tomy's Blip. These were the first simple electronic games, like Simon. It was a portable electronic game, but it wasn't like a video game that you'd play at home or the arcade. Now, for kids growing up in the late 1970s, playing against a computer felt futuristic. But as the technology became better, the arcade experience would soon fit on your table or in the palm of your hand. This is when Coleco enters the story. Coleco was a toy company that started off in the 1930s as a leather goods company, making leather boot repair kits. The name Coleco is actually an acronym for the Connecticut Leather Company. The company started in 1932, and during World War II, their boot repair kits were being sold to the US military, and the company grew exponentially. By the 1950s, the company diversified their leather goods company and started making plastic molded toys. In the 1960s, Coleco started buying up smaller toy manufacturers and making swimming pools. And amazingly at the time, they became the world's largest supplier of above-ground swimming pools. Then, in 1972, Coleco bought a snowmobile company. This turned out to be a poor business acquisition. Sales of the snowmobiles were horrific, and it was costing Coleco millions. It was time to diversify again, or risk losing the company. This is when Arnold Greenberg became CEO in 1975 and invested heavily in the video game market. In 1976, Coleco released the Telstar, a dedicated home Pong console. Sales of these systems skyrocketed, loosening Coleco's financial burden over the snowmobile blunder years earlier. But Coleco didn't stop there. They also noticed a new market was opening up. the portable game market, and it quickly became one of the company's biggest opportunities. Unlike most competitors, Coleco understood something very important: presentation matters. Coleco knew how to make these simple electronic games feel very exciting and how to market them. Coleco's early handhelds relied on LED technology. LEDs were placed under a playfield that had some sort of overlay on it. Electronic Quarterback is a good example of this. The lit LEDs represent the players on the field. As you move, the LED turns off, and where you move to, that LED lights up. Simple when you look at it now, but back then, this was high tech. Electronic football sold like crazy, so Coleco continued to produce more portables. Some of their best were the head-to-head electronic baseball, electronic basketball, and electronic hockey. These type of systems hit their peak with games like Total Control 4, a massive tabletop unit for head-to-head sports action. It used cartridges with overlays to change the type of game being played. Now, I'm saying the word cartridge loosely because they're really just jumper carts, like what the original Magnavox Odyssey used. The games are pre-programmed in the system itself, and the carts just use jumpers to tell what game is needed to be played. Long before cable links and Wi-Fi, Coleco was experimenting with multiplayer gaming, and Gen X kids like myself ate it right up. By the early 1980s, the arcade craze was in full swing. Games like Pac-Man, Galaxian, Donkey Kong, and Frogger were dominating the arcades and home console market. At the time, these weren't just games anymore, they were cultural icons. Coleco realized this and saw another great marketing idea. Instead of making more sports-type games, why not license the arcade hits and make them portable? This made portable gaming more exciting. Now you could carry Pac-Man around with you anywhere. And to top it off, it gave you that arcade feel while playing it. And the main reason for this was its presentation. The game just looked the part. They actually looked like mini arcade cabinets. And all the kids wanted one, me being one of them back in the day. They had the same colorful side art, marquees, and control panel artwork, just like the arcade cabinets. And for a lot of us kids, this was the closest thing we could own compared to a real arcade.
My own Pac-Man!
And if you had one, you were living the dream. The biggest showstopper of these systems was its display technology, the bright glowing vacuum fluorescent display. Now this technology wasn't new, but what Coleco did with it brought these games to life. When compared to standard LED displays, the VFD displays looked absolutely amazing. They were brighter, more colorful, and far more arcade-like. However, the technology that drives the display is not much different from the old sports games. Every character, border, ship, missile is just waiting to light up once the object is moved into that position. Once you closely look at the display, you'll realize how simple it is, but also see how clever the engineering was to make these. A further look inside shows how these games use similar technology to the earlier electronic games. Most of Coleco's tabletops use custom chips and actually had the games etched into the silicone die. Simply put, it was Pac-Man on a calculator chip. Sound was also impressive. Although it was only beeps, it could produce multiple sound effects, arcade tones, and recognizable music from the arcade games. Compared to the competitors, Coleco's tabletops sounded premium. One of the best-selling mini arcades was Pac-Man, and it's easy to understand why. Pac-Man fever was in full swing when Coleco released it. Its glowing maze and gameplay really made it feel like you were playing the arcade at home. It's been reported that over 1.5 million of these Pac-Man units sold over its lifespan. Coleco followed this with a range of other arcade hits like Frogger, Galaxian, Miss Pac-Man, and more. Then came Donkey Kong, one of the earliest licensed Nintendo IPs for handhelds. Way before Super Mario on the NES, Coleco had introduced Nintendo characters to Americans on their tabletops. This is a relationship that Nintendo and Coleco had until the ColecoVision's launch. In 1983, Coleco released the most interesting mini arcades using reflective technology. The first different style of game was Donkey Kong Jr. Gone was the VFD display, replaced by a color LCD that reflected downward and used an outside light source to backlight the screen. The tech inside changed as well. Really, it was a Nintendo Game & Watch in a mini cabinet form, with the clock and alarm features much different than the earlier released Coleco tabletops. Then came the crown jewel of the Coleco tabletop collection, Zaxxon. Now, Zaxxon uses a completely different concept for the VFD display. It actually uses two VFDs and a reflective glass surface to create a pseudo 3D effect. The front VFD had the ground enemies in the walls, while the back VFD had your ships on it. The two VFDs used in conjunction with the reflective glass gave a simulated depth of perception that looked light years beyond what any other tabletop was doing at the time. Just remember, this was simple VFD technology with brilliant engineering tricks, no sprites, polygons, or anything we would relate to video game graphics today. And that's what made this era of portable gaming so fascinating. Engineers and developers squeezing every ounce of the limited technology they had to play around with. And somehow, it just worked. Just ask any Gen X kid and they'll tell you how amazing these things were at the time. But technology never stands still, and by 1983, another display technology was taking over the market: LCD, or liquid crystal display. Nintendo had been using it for years and actually shared the tech with Coleco and the Donkey Kong Jr. tabletop. Nintendo's Game & Watches were slowly taking over the market as they were cheaper to produce and they were cheaper for the consumer to purchase. They were also much more compact and could easily fit in your pocket to take anywhere. The old VFD technology was starting to look pretty dated. VFDs took too much battery power, added extra heat to the unit, and were extremely expensive to produce compared to the LCD screens. Also, portable game consoles with programmable cartridges were starting to take off with the launch of the MicroVision in 1979, and others like Entex AdventureVision and Epoch's Game Pocket computer being released, which eventually led to the development of the GameBoy. These newer handhelds were really the nail in the coffin for the dedicated tabletop systems. Players now wanted cartridge-based game libraries and smaller, more portable handheld systems, and dedicated Coleco tabletops slowly faded away. The story of the MicroVision starts in the mid-1970s. Jay Smith and his firm Smith Engineering wanted to get into the evolving video game market. This is the same Jay Smith that later developed the Vectrex. But instead of creating another home game console, he wanted to make portable games. The first game that Smith helped create was Mattel's Electronic Football. This game became an instant hit for Mattel, which got the attention of Milton Bradley. In 1978, Milton Bradley released the Ralph Baer designed Simon game, which was a huge success. After Simon's success, they wanted to get into the portable handheld market. They saw the success Smith had with the Electronic Football game and asked Smith Engineering to design a portable game console. Smith got to work on the project. He wanted to create a true portable game console with interchangeable game cartridges, just like the home consoles had. Due to the challenges that this brought, no company had attempted it yet. However, the biggest issue was screen technology at the time. Really, only two types of displays were available: vacuum fluorescent or LCD. LCD technology was still relatively new, and the biggest producer of LCD screens at the time was Hughes Aircraft. Earlier in the 1970s, Smith Engineering had started to supply Hughes with the chemical needed to make the screens. With their experience in the manufacturing process, Smith started to design their own screen for the new portable. The finished screen would be 16 by 16 pixels, being able to use all 16 in a row, unheard of at the time. Up to this point, only 3 rows could be used at once. After the screen was designed, the cartridge was next. The best way for them to do it at the time was to put the CPU inside the cartridge, because each game would be different. It would keep cost of the unit down and make it simple to design around. The actual unit only had the screen, the LCD driver circuitry, the controls, and the power components. The rest would be handled by the individual cartridges. Once the prototype was finished, they presented it to Milton Bradley, but the design was denied. It was about the size of the original Game Boy, but Milton Bradley wanted the console to be bigger because apparently Americans like things bigger. So they redesigned the case to be bigger and more elongated. They went back to Milton Bradley, and at this time it was approved for production. After the approval, Smith got to work making games for the console. The first games which were ready by the MicroVision's release were Blockbuster, Bowling, Connect 4, and Pinball. It was also around this time that there were issues obtaining the CPU, the Intel 8021 processor. With the shortages, Smith knew they could not produce enough units. So they switched over to the Texas Instruments TMS 1100. The unit had advantages and disadvantages. On the plus side, it took less voltage to power the TMS 1100, but the CPU was less powerful, and all the games had to be reprogrammed for the new processor. The MicroVision was released in November of 1979 in the US, Canada, and Europe. It was a huge success for them at first, selling enough units to garner $8 million in profit in its first year of sales. By the end of 1979, 3 more games were released: Mindbuster, Star Trek Phaser Strike, and Vegas Slots. With his perceived success, Smith Engineering invested a lot of money into designing the next MicroVision to replace the current one. The new console would have an unheard of 32 by 32 pixel backlit screen and have a CPU based inside the unit. But right about this time, things started to change for the MicroVision. Many of the units were failing due to the screen turning completely black, known as screen rot. The manufacturing process for the screens was not the best of quality. The screens may have been contaminated during the manufacturing process, in between the layers of the LCD. This is what causes screen rot. Many of the units were being warrantied, and it was starting to cost Milton Bradley money. Then other issues started to pop up. The cartridges, which housed the CPUs, were very sensitive to static electricity. Just touching the contacts could result in the game frying. Word started to get out about the quality issues, and sales started to slump. In 1980 and 81, there were 4 more games made for the system: Baseball, Sea Duel, Alien Raiders, and Cosmic Hunter. These were the last games to be released in the US or Canada. Sometime in 1981, Smith showed Milton Bradley the new improved version of the system they had been working on, but Milton Bradley nixed it right away. This was because of the issues that the current MicroVision was having, and then they were starting to get infringement lawsuits over some of the games that were being made for the system. At this point, Milton Bradley was done. They discontinued the MicroVision in 1981, and there was one more game released in 1982 in Europe, Super Blockbuster. The MicroVision had a 2-year lifespan, from 1979 until 1981. It sold about 200,000 units and was the first portable handheld console with interchangeable cartridges, and was the inspiration for the future Nintendo Game Boy. The story of the Game & Watch starts in the 1970s when game designer Gunpei Yokoi, head of Nintendo's research and development of its toys and game division, took a train ride home and noticed a businessman on the train playing with a calculator. This is when a thought came to his head that he could make a game out of calculator parts. An affordable electronic game that you could kill time with while waiting in line or on train rides. Seemed like a perfect idea. When he got back to Nintendo, he pitched the idea to Nintendo's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi. After the pitch, Yamauchi asked Yokoi to chauffeur him to a business meeting. I'm sure that request seemed odd, but Yokoi obliged. It turns out that this business meeting was with the CEO of Sharp, and Yamauchi wanted Yokoi to pitch his idea at this meeting. Nintendo and Sharp struck a deal to use Sharp's SN500 series of 4-bit microcontrollers for this project. Yokoi had full control over the development, and he wanted a game controller kind of like the arcades had, and actually developed the D-pad. And before long, the first Game & Watch game was released, named Ball. It was a simple game just juggling balls on an LCD screen. This was the first of 60 games to be released on the platform. Nintendo stated that it used the profit off the Game & Watches to develop the Famicom, which here in the US we all know as the NES, or Nintendo Entertainment System. Without the development of the NES, Nintendo might not be the powerhouse they are today, and video game history may have been completely changed. With a launch date in 1980, and it being discontinued in 1991, the Game & Watch series had a successful 11-year run. During that time, Nintendo sold 43.3 million units, making it the Kickstarter for the Nintendo Entertainment System and for the Nintendo Corporation as a whole. The year is 1981, and the idea of interchangeable cartridges in a handheld has been out there for a while now with the MicroVision. Other companies were paying close attention to this, and one of those companies was Entex. Enter the Entex Select a Game. You can picture somebody at Entex that looks at the Milton Bradley MicroVision and said, alright, well this is a solid idea, but I think we can do this differently, and more importantly, we can do this on the cheap. And basically that's what this thing was. It wasn't a reinvention or a clone, but a reinterpretation of the same idea. Now, it doesn't have an LCD. Instead, it has a VFD, or vacuum fluorescent display. And if you never saw one in person, it has this certain glow to it. The bright reds, the soothing blues. But compared to the MicroVision, it felt alive. It just popped in a way that early LCD screens just couldn't do. But once you get past the flashy display, you start to realize something pretty quick. Under the hood, it's basically the same trick as the MicroVision. There was no CPU inside of the base unit, so everything, the processor, the ROM, everything was inside of the cartridge. So once again, just like the MicroVision, the game cartridge itself is really the console, and the console is just a piece of plastic that has the controls on it, which was a fascinating idea. And then you have the design of this thing. So it was supposed to be a handheld, but it felt a lot more like a tabletop. I mean, this thing was bulky, because if you had to hold this thing in your hands, yeah, you're gonna get real sore real quick. This isn't something you would put in your back pocket. This is something you would put in your backpack. Now, the library was already small to begin with. We're talking about 6 games, and that's it. And one of them was very familiar looking, and yeah, that didn't go unnoticed. Now, Coleco at the time had the licensing rights to Pac-Man for handhelds. And what do you think happened next? Lawyers got involved, the courts got involved, and the game got pulled off the market. And suddenly, their little tiny library even got smaller. So when you step back and look at the whole picture, it's not hard to see why this thing struggled. It was big, it was bulky, it was limited, and by 1981, it felt like it was chasing something that it just couldn't catch up to. And it just didn't have enough push forward with the idea. And this is where the Selecta game becomes really interesting, because it's not quite a handheld, not quite a console, not quite an evolution, and not quite good enough to succeed in the market. It was just an experiment that never fully figured out what it wanted to be. So let's go into 1982, when handheld portable systems were really starting to show their way into the market. One came out that was truly weird. It was called the Entex AdventureVision. Now, when you first lay eyes on this thing, you don't think it's a handheld, and you don't think it's a home console. It looks really like a mini arcade cabinet, something like you'd see sitting in the corner of a pizza place in the early 1980s. And this is where things go from being weird to being weirder, because the AdventureVision doesn't have a normal screen per se. There's no LCD, no CRT, no vacuum fluorescent display, nothing like that. Instead, it uses a spinning mirror and a vertical strip of LEDs, and that's it. So here's how it works. Inside the unit, there's a motor spinning a mirror at high speed. Next to it, you've got a single row, or column actually, of red LEDs. As the mirror spins, it reflects the column across your field of view, over and over and over and over and over again, so fast that your brain stitches it all together as one full image. This is pretty much the same technology that Nintendo used in the Virtual Boy about a decade later. Now, under the hood of this thing, it was powered by the Intel 8048 processor, something you'd find in a lot of early electronics at the time. And the resolution, it was roughly, I think 150 by 40. At least that's what your eyes thought you were seeing, but like I said, technically, it was just a line of LEDs being flung across space pretty much. Okay, so here's the catch. Well, actually several catches. First of all, there's a motor inside this thing, and that means noise. A constant mechanical hum when you're playing. And secondly, this thing chews through power and just eats batteries alive. And then there was the big one. That mirror system, if it failed, that was it. You had absolutely no picture, no image, and you couldn't play the game anymore. Reliability of this console was really in question. And even if everything worked perfectly, you didn't have a lot to play with, because the entire library is only 4 games. That's it. Just 4. So if you've never heard of this system, numbers don't lie. Estimates suggest that around 10,000 units were ever made, and who knows how many were actually sold. This thing barely existed. And that's what makes the AdventureVision so fascinating. Because really this thing crosses the line between genius and over-engineering, in a way like no other system does. It's not just different, it's boldly different, and maybe just a little too far ahead of where the technology and the market were ready to go at the time. Let's take a trip to 1984. Now this is a time right after the great American video game crash in 1983 and how it just tore through the video game industry. Companies were folding, retailers were pulling back, and consumers, well, they lost confidence in the video game market. And right in the middle of all that chaos, one company stepped up that you probably never heard of, Palmtex, and they released the Super Micro. And somehow, they chose the absolute worst time in video game history to release a new handheld console. But this is where the story starts to get interesting, because if you look at just the hardware, the cartridges included a 32x16 LCD display, and the screen itself was backlit. Also, they had the CPU and the RAM and ROM on the cartridge itself. So this thing looked really good on paper, so why didn't it succeed? Well, there's a few reasons for that. The first reason being that it only had 3 games in the entire library, and that was it. And basically that wasn't enough to gain consumer confidence on launch. And obviously there was no other titles launched afterwards because this console was shortly lived. Now the second reason would be the build quality of this thing. So when you held it in your hands, it just felt like a cheap toy. It would creak and it would crank and it would do everything when you're hitting all the buttons, and it just felt really cheap in your hands. And that's to be, understandable, seeing that most of the electronics were inside the cartridge itself, while the base unit was really just the controller. Now on top of all this, there was only 5,000 of these units ever made, so it makes this one of the most rare retro gaming consoles ever made. And if you're a retro collector and you got one of these, you're definitely one of the fortunate ones, because these things go for a ton of money now if you can get your hands on one. But really, timing mattered, and the Palmtex showed up at the exact moment that the industry wasn't ready to believe in anything new. So instead of being remembered as a stepping stone, it just kind of disappeared from history, lost in the aftermath of a market that had already collapsed. Now we head to 1984 Japan, because while North America was still recovering from the video game crash, innovation didn't stop everywhere. It was actually growing. So enter the Epoch Game Pocket Computer. Now Epoch wasn't some unknown startup company. I mean, they were the Epoch Company, a company that already had its skin in the game. They were behind systems like the Epoch Cassette Vision and Super Cassette Vision, which in Japan actually found a decent level of success. And beyond that, they were deeply rooted in the portable electronic toys, such as baseball and football and other electronic portable devices. So this wasn't their first attempt at something like this. They had experience and they understood the market space, and you can feel that the second you look at the system. Because compared to everything else that we talked about so far, this feels different. The design was better and the layout makes more sense, and the idea of a handheld console really starts to feel cohesive. And yet, it's still not quite there. And that's because of the game library, with 5 titles. Better than some of the earlier cartridge-based portable systems, but still nowhere near enough to build real momentum for the product or a consumer baseline. So why does the Game Pocket Computer matter? Well, by 1984, you can start to see the pieces starting to line up. Cartridges are no longer a novelty, they're basically expected. And portable screens, they were improving, and game design was evolving. Controls were getting closer to what players actually wanted, and that's why this moment in time is so interesting, because it feels like a pause, like everything's about to click, but it hasn't quite yet. And this is the calm before the storm, because in just a few years, everything is about to change. The story of the Game Boy starts in the mid-1980s. Gunpei Yokoi held a meeting with Nintendo's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, about developing a portable game system with interchangeable cartridges, somewhat like what Milton Bradley did years earlier with the MicroVision. However, they would implement a new LCD screen technology called dot matrix. With the popularity of the gaming watch and its portable design, and the success of the Famicom and the NES, Yamauchi was not hesitant to give the go-ahead to start development. Yokoi and Nintendo's R&D 1 team, led by Satoru Okada, started development of the new system called the Dot Matrix game. Because a joystick would be unpractical on the system, Yokoi wanted to use the D-pad he created on the Game & Watch. Since the NES controller was so popular, they made the controller design almost identical to the NES with the D-pad, A, B, start, and select buttons. Also, the system had to be small enough to fit in one's pocket. Unlike the MicroVision, Nintendo wanted the CPU to be in the system and not on the individual cartridges. For the CPU, Nintendo worked with Sharp to create a custom chip that was a hybrid between the Intel 8080 and the Zilog Z80 CPU. The screen would be a 2.6-inch LCD dot matrix display with a 160 by 144 pixel resolution. During the design phase,
Shigesato Itoi
saw the prototype and named it the Game Boy. The name stuck, but the dot matrix game name still appeared on the Game Boy as a model number, DMG01. However, not everything was great. Employees within Nintendo didn't like the Game Boy and thought it wouldn't be successful. They even deemed it the Dame game, which Dame means helpless or useless in Japanese. Despite this, development continued on. In 1987, Nintendo had shown the prototype to several trade shows. Interest grew in the product. Gunpei Yokoi wanted the system to have a great game library. With the popularity of Super Mario Bros. On the NES, they knew the system needed a Mario game for it.
Gunpei Yokoi and Satoru Okada
developed Super Mario Land. It was intended to be the pack-in game with the system worldwide. However, interest in the Russian game Tetris in North America was peaking in popularity at the time, and Nintendo saw this as an opportunity. Hank Rogers bought the rights to the game and worked with Nintendo to port it over to the Game Boy. Tetris was the pack-in game for the system in every region except Japan. Nintendo spent over $10 million marketing the Game Boy before launch. The Game Boy was released in Japan in April of 1989 with the pack-in game Super Mario Land. Then it was released in North America in July and Europe in September of 1990, with Tetris being the pack-in game. The system was wildly successful. In Japan, Nintendo sold out of the entire inventory by March and had to produce more. The system was just as popular around the globe, selling millions of units within the first year. 6 games were available at launch: Alleyway, Baseball, Super Mario Land, Tennis, Tetris, and Yakuman. With sales of the console soaring, so did the number of game titles. By 1990, Nintendo had competition with NEC, Sega, and Atari with the PC Engine Express, Turbo GT, Game Gear, and Lynx. But the Game Boy turned out to be the clear winner in this competition. Although it was not as advanced as the others without a color backlit screen, the fact that it had a 14-hour battery life and a lower price made it the leader of the portable game systems of the time. The story of the Atari Lynx actually starts in the mid-1980s at Amiga. To understand the story of the Lynx, we first have to understand what was going on with Team Amiga. The Amiga 1000 launched in 1985, and while it was revolutionary with its incredible graphics, multitasking, and audio that blew away Macintosh and PC, the behind-the-scenes story wasn't all peaches and roses. After Commodore had bought Amiga Corporation, many of the original engineers weren't exactly thrilled with the direction the company was headed. Corporate changes, budget cuts, and internal policies had led several key figures to leave the company. Among those that left were R.J. Michael, Dave Needle, and David Morris, some of the very minds that were responsible for Amiga's hardware and software design. These were people who loved pushing technology to its limits. The team eventually joined forces with Epoch, the game company famous for titles like California Games, Summer Games, and Winter Games. Epoch was doing well creatively, but not necessarily financially. Still, the newly merged engineering group had the energy of a startup. They could try new things and they could innovate without any kind of permission. And that's exactly what they did. During one of their brainstorming sessions, the team sketched out ideas for a portable game console. But not just any portable. They wanted something light years beyond the Game & Watch or MicroVision, those kind of portables from that era. They envisioned a full-color handheld with real processing power, Something that could run arcade-style games with scaling sprites, smooth animation, and rich audio. And they wanted it to be comfortable and ergonomic, not something small like the Game & Watch. It was at this point that they started on the prototype that they dubbed the Handy. The prototype Handy was shaped differently than the Lynx that we know today. The early Handy was more rectangular with a bigger screen and a very 80s looking design. But at the heart of the system, the chips, the technology, and the idea, that all became part of the Lynx that we know today. Development of the Handy was progressing well. Epoch loved it, the engineers loved it, and the early demos were actually really impressive. But there was a giant problem looming over the company. Epoch was hemorrhaging money. They simply just didn't have the resources to manufacture a handheld, launch it worldwide, market it, and support its release. Production costs were going to be atrocious. And this is where the plot twist comes in, because out of all the possible companies Epoch could have partnered with, the one that stepped up was Atari Corporation, led by Jack Tramiel. Yeah, that Jack Tramiel, the former Commodore CEO whose rivalry with Amiga was infamous. At first glance, it seems bizarre. The original Amiga team ends up working under Jack Tramiel and Atari. But the truth is simple. Epoch needed a partner. Atari needed new hardware to compete with Nintendo and Sega, and the Handy had the wow factor that Atari was looking for. Atari struck the deal with Epoch, would finish the hardware and develop the early software, while Atari would handle manufacturing, marketing, and distribution. R.J. Michael and Dave Needle continued working on the system during this transaction. They helped Atari finalize the design, refine the hardware, and shape the interface. In fact, R.J. Michael personally designed much of the Lynx's operating system and software libraries. And it was at this moment that Atari rebranded the Handy as the Atari Lynx. The system that we recognize today began to take shape. The shell had been redesigned to Atari's liking, and it was somewhat ergonomic, with the reversible orientation so you could play games either in the vertical or horizontal position. In 1989, Atari launched the Lynx. It was miles ahead of anything else on the market. Nintendo's Game Boy was brand new, sure, but the Game Boy wasn't a technological powerhouse. The Lynx, on the other hand, it was literally an arcade machine in your hands. The Lynx had a full-color backlit LCD screen, hardware sprite scaling and rotation, a 16-bit graphics engine paired with an 8-bit CPU, comm links, a multiplayer network, left-hand mode, and games that looked far beyond what the Nintendo Game Boy could do at the time. Now let's take a deeper dive into the hardware inside the Lynx, because this is where the system truly shines. Under the hood you'll find two ASIC chips, the first being the Mikey chip. It is a built-in 65 SCO2 processor running at 4 MHz. It also acts as a system sound chip and controls DMA. The second chip is the Suzy. It handles graphics, sprites, hit detection, and controller input. A lot of magic in the Lynx comes from the way these chips work with one another. And then lastly, we have the two DRAM chips totaling 64 kilobytes of system RAM. Now the screen, though primitive by today's standards, was a huge leap forward in 1989. Color, backlit, and a refresh rate that made the fast animations in the games possible. Sure, it was washed out in the bright sunlight, but compared to the Game Boy's green-tinted display, it was like day and night. In 1991, Atari released the Lynx 2, a redesigned, cheaper-to-produce, more efficient version of the original Lynx. It was smaller and lighter and more ergonomic. It had the same resolution on the screen, but a better backlighting system and contrast. The buttons had a different feel and had a new rubberized D-pad. But the sound on the system was noticeably weaker and just sounded cheaper. Now the power was more efficient and could last up to 5 to 6 hours on 6 AA batteries. So with all this amazing tech and the color screen, why didn't the Atari Lynx take over the handheld market? Well, there's a few reasons for that. So one factor was the price of the system. The Lynx cost significantly more than the Game Boy. Parents looked at the shelves and usually went with the more affordable option. Then there was the battery life. The Lynx ate up AA batteries like no tomorrow, and the Game Boy could get up to 30 hours on 4AA batteries. That alone kind of killed the sales because parents didn't want to keep dumping batteries into these systems. The next thing was the size. Now, the original Lynx was huge and the Lynx 2 was just a little bit smaller, but still pretty big. Not too portable, whereas the Game Boy, you could literally just fit right in your pocket. And that kind of detracted a few people because it just wasn't all that portable. And speaking of Nintendo was really the biggest factor in all this. They had an unbelievable shelf dominance, and many stores couldn't even carry Atari stock because Nintendo's contracts were just so aggressive with them. And then there was Atari's marketing of the Lynx. For every Atari commercial, there were probably 20 Game Boy commercials, and that really just destroyed sales of the system as well. And the final nail in the coffin for the Lynx was the release of the TurboExpress and the Sega Game Gear. These systems gave the Atari Lynx direct competition in the color screen handheld market. And unfortunately for the Atari Lynx, Atari itself was coming to an end and discontinued the Atari Lynx in 1995. Even though the Lynx never reached mass market success, its legacy is strong among retro collectors and hardware fans today. It was the first handheld with a color LCD screen, was also the first handheld with a backlit screen, the first with hardware scaling and rotation, and the first to support multiplayer networking. The Lynx was ambitious, forward-thinking, and created by people who weren't afraid to take risks. You can still feel the Amiga DNA running through its veins. The story of the Game Gear starts in 1979. This is when Milton Bradley released the first handheld system with interchangeable games, called the MicroVision. This handheld instituted a new technology, the LCD dot matrix screen. Before this, only simple LCD screens such as calculators and watches were made. However, the technology just was not perfected yet, and the MicroVision was plagued with screen rot issues, leading to its quick demise. Though handheld games were still popular, games like Mattel's electronic sports games, Coleco's tabletops, and Nintendo's Game & Watches were selling really well. By the mid-1980s, the video game market went through the Great Crash, and Nintendo, a little-known company besides in Japan, took off with the release of the NES. Sega had been competing with Nintendo in the Japanese game market with consoles like the SG-1000 and the Mark II. However, they never really gained a foothold in the Japanese marketplace against the Famicom. Then in 1985, Sega released the Sega Mark III in Japan, and then in 1986, they released a redesigned Mark III called the Master System to compete with Nintendo's NES in North America. By 1987, Nintendo and Sega were in a full console war. Nintendo was still king of the consoles, even in North America. To stay on top, they had to come up with another great system. With the success of the Game & Watches, Nintendo saw a great opportunity in the handheld market. When they started the design of the Game Boy, Nintendo went all the way back to the MicroVision days and created a handheld with interchangeable games and a modernized dot matrix screen. In 1989, Nintendo released the Game Boy, and it was a phenomenon. Sales of the system skyrocketed. Meanwhile, Sega released their new 16-bit home console, the Mega Drive, or better known as the Genesis here in North America. Sales of the system were slow in Japan, but in North America and Europe, they took off. Sega was finally outselling Nintendo's NES. Now they had their sights on the handheld market that Nintendo had took by storm. In mid-1989, Project Mercury was started. This was the code name given to Sega's handheld prototype. The project was spearheaded by Sega lead engineer Hideki Sato. He wanted a portable game system that had a color backlit screen. And by this time, the technology that was used in the Sega Master System could be shrunk down small enough to power a new handheld that would keep R&D costs down to a minimum. But Sato didn't want it to be just a new handheld portable Master System, so they got to work updating the old VDP or video display processor. By the time they were done, they developed a much better VDP that provided 4,096 colors, which was 64 times the amount of colors that the Sega Master System produced with only 64 colors. Also during this time, a new competitor entered the handheld market, Atari with their Lynx handheld, and unlike the Game Boy, the Lynx had a color backlit screen. Now Sega had two competitors, Nintendo and Atari. Atari released the Lynx in November of 1989, and to make matters worse, Sega heard that another competitor was developing their color backlit handheld, NEC with the PC Engine GT and TurboExpress handhelds. Development of the new Mercury project was completed in early 1990, and the system was renamed Game Gear. This was a name chosen by Michael Katz, Sega of America's CEO. The Game Gear was released in Japan on October 6, 1990. It was then debuted at the 1991 Winter CES show with positive reviews. Folks liked the color backlit screen and the games that were shown. Initial sales of the system were good. More than 40,000 units sold in the first 2 days in Japan, and they sold more than 90,000 units in the first 2 months, with over 600,000 units on backorder. The Game Gear then released in North America and in Europe in April of 1991 and in Australia in 1992. Sales in North America and Europe started good as well, selling over 100,000 units in the first few months. However, things were not as good as they seemed. With the system taking 6 AA batteries and battery life only being between 4 to 6 hours, where the Game Boy got well over 20 hours of battery life off the 4 AA batteries. Complaints started to come in. Sega tried a few different things to help. They released a rechargeable NiCad battery pack that clipped onto your belt and plugged into the Game Gear, giving it between 8 to 12 hours of gameplay, but it still was well behind what the Game Boy battery life was. Sega also released a battery that attached to the back of the Game Gear, but people complained that it made the console too heavy and too thick to play comfortably. The last thing that Sega did to try to conserve on power consumption, they integrated most of the chips into one. The CPU, VDP, and SCA chips were all combined into one ASIC chip, but this did little to conserve on power. Then the consumers started to complain about the lack of third-party games. Sega did have some third parties making games for them, but just like on the home consoles, Nintendo had contracts with most third parties, and their games never made it to Sega systems. By 1995, sales of the Game Gear had slumped horribly. Sega knew that they had lost to the Game Boy and released the Sega Nomad, a portable Sega Genesis. They did this to try to get a stronger hold on the handheld market and to keep the aging Genesis alive for a bit longer. But by 1997, the writing was on the wall. Sega discontinued the Game Gear. Sega had refocused their efforts on the home console market and the upcoming Dreamcast. Through its lifespan, the Game Gear had a few cool accessories. They released a TV tuner for it so you could watch your favorite TV shows on the go. They also released the Game Link, a cable that linked 2 Game Gears together so you could play 2-player games together. Pretty cool. Then there was also the FM tuner released for the system. Sega also released the Master System adapter that allowed you to play Sega Master System games on the Game Gear. The Sega Game Gear had a 7-year lifespan from 1990 till 1997. During that time, they sold over 10 million units worldwide and had over 350 games available for the system, being Sega's first and best-selling handheld. While Nintendo focused on battery life, Sega concentrated on color, and Atari was just trying to keep the company alive with a new product, NEC took a completely different approach to handheld gaming. Instead of creating a simplified version of a home video game console, they took their home video game console and turned it into a handheld. This was unheard of at the time. NEC was not new to the gaming industry. In the early 1980s, NEC and their computers helped develop some of the first Famicom games, which ultimately led to Nintendo games being released on NEC's PC-88 system. But by the mid-1980s, NEC was ready to fully jump into the video game market. Development of the PC Engine, or better known in the US as the TurboGrafx-16, started. The PC Engine was released in 1987 in Japan and was surprisingly successful against Nintendo and Sega. In fact, NEC outsold Sega in Japan up until the release of the Mega Drive. They revealed a new form of media for your games, the Hue card, much like the design of Sega's My Cards. While the PC Engine was a success in Japan, the opposite could be said about the TurboGrafx release in North America in 1989. It struggled from the start due to poor marketing and unfamiliar game titles. But this didn't deter NEC. They continued to expand their game systems. Not wanting to fall behind its competitors, NEC knew they needed to get into the handheld gaming market, especially after the release of the Game Boy. By 1990, NEC released the PC Engine GT in Japan and the TurboExpress in North America. But unlike the Game Boy or Game Gear, NEC's new handheld was truly their current home video game console in a handheld form factor with a color screen. So no downgraded ports or simplified versions of their home console games. You were literally playing the full console games on a handheld system you could take with you anywhere, using the same Hue cards as the TurboGrafx-16 or the PC Engine. At the heart of this machine, it was essentially the same hardware architecture found inside the PC Engine and TurboGrafx-16. Inside you'll find the same HU6280 8-bit CPU, the 16-bit HU-C6270 video display processor, and the HU6260 video color encoder. It really was a PC Engine shrunk down to fit inside a handheld. NEC had just created the most powerful handheld the world had ever seen. The TurboExpress and PC Engine GT featured a full-color backlit screen, stereo sound, and graphics that virtually destroyed everything else on the market. In 1990, for people that experienced the TurboExpress, it felt like the future. But there was a price to pay for all that power, actually several prices. First was the cost. It launched for $250 in 1990, where you could get the Game Boy for $89. This positioned the TurboExpress in the premium market and not the mass consumer market, leading to lower sales. And it had the same issue that plagued the Sega Game Gear and the Atari Lynx, and that's battery life. The system required 6 AA batteries, and under heavy use, players could burn through them in only just a couple hours. The TurboExpress quickly gained a reputation as a machine that practically ate batteries alive. Still, despite its flaws, the TurboExpress represented something incredible for its time. A true portable home video game console experience years before the Nintendo Switch. But NEC wasn't done yet. They decided to make something even more mind-blowing. In 1991, NEC released the PC Engine LT exclusively in Japan. This was a much larger portable system in the form factor of a laptop, with a folding clamshell design. Once again, using the same chipset as the PC Engine, but unlike the TurboExpress or PC Engine GT, it only ran on external power. It did not have batteries. But it did offer expansion capabilities with the CD-ROM units. The most impressive thing was its 4-inch color active matrix LCD screen. At the time, it was one of the best color backlit LCD screens on the market. It had bright colors, great contrast, sharp motion, and wide viewing angles unlike most competitor screens. For the early 1990s, it was amazingly advanced. But all this over-engineering came at a cost. It launched at a cost of 100,000 yen. That was an insane amount of money, and because of this, sales were very low, making the PC Engine LT one of the most sought-after handheld systems by collectors today. Looking back now, NEC's portable systems almost feel like technology from an alternate timeline, machines built with almost no compromises, built years before batteries, screens, and manufacturing costs were truly ready to support them. They weren't really a commercial success, but a technological one. They showed the world something remarkable, that home console quality portable gaming was possible, even if it arrived decades way too early. As Nintendo's Game Boy began dominating store shelves around the world, something else started to happen. Smaller companies began flooding the market with low-cost handheld systems hoping to cash in on the portable gaming craze. By the early 1990s, the success of the Game Boy had proven one thing beyond a doubt. Handheld gaming was no longer a gimmick, it was big business. And as LCD technology became cheaper to manufacture, dozens of companies saw the opportunity. Some tried to compete with Nintendo through innovation, and others simply tried to imitate them. So let's check out some of the wild Game Boy wannabes. And one of the earliest of these was the Gamate. Released around 1990 by a Taiwanese company called Bit Corporation, the Gamate looked very familiar. With a monochrome dot matrix screen and interchangeable game cartridges, it was clearly designed to compete directly with Nintendo's Game Boy. But unlike Nintendo, the Bit Corporation lacked the massive development resources, polish, and third-party support needed to truly compete with Nintendo. The overall design of the console was cheap, with cheap molded plastic that felt like it would break if you hit a button too hard. And the screen suffered from severe motion blur and ghosting, even by early handheld standards. Fast-moving games became difficult to follow due to all the motion blur, making many titles feel sluggish and unresponsive. Although it was a smaller company, they actually sold the Gamate in America, some parts of Europe, Australia, Taiwan, and China. In the larger markets like the US, it failed miserably, but the Gamate found modest success in smaller international markets thanks to one thing, and that was its price. It was cheaper than the Game Boy, and for many families, that alone made it appealing. And then there's the game library. The Gamate just didn't have third-party support, and most of the games were clones of actual games like Bomberman, Lode Runner, and Tetris. Officially, about 30 games were made for the system, but even more counterfeit games were made, bringing that total up to about 70 games or so. Although not very successful, the Gamate did have a 4-year lifespan, being discontinued in 1994. Today, the Gamate is remembered less for its games, and more as an example of just how quickly companies rushed to produce cheaply made products to chase Nintendo's success in portable gaming. The next Game Boy wannabe on the list is the Watara Supervision, perhaps the most famous Game Boy competitor that most people have really never heard of. Released in 1992, the Supervision was marketed heavily as a budget-friendly alternative to Nintendo's Game Boy. It was sold in Asian and some European and North American markets. The name of the system changed depending on the region it was sold in. For instance, in the UK it was sold as the Quickshot Supervision, while in Germany it was sold as the Hartung Supervision. The main marketing goal of this system was to undercut Nintendo in price and sell units. The Supervision in the US sold for almost half the cost of the Game Boy. The system featured a large, for the time, dot matrix screen, stereo sound, multiplayer support with a link port, and video that could be output to the TV with a special adapter. It came in 2 models, the flex screen where you could adjust the viewing angle of the screen, or the second model with the fixed screen that looked an awful lot like a Game Boy. And unlike most gaming companies, they already had 50 games ready available at launch. Things were actually looking pretty good for the Supervision. That was until people started buying them and playing the games. While the system itself was somewhat impressive, the games were very lackluster, and the screen suffered from massive motion blur. And the games? Well, they were just cheap. At $15, you got what you paid for here. In fact, a critic from Electronic Games magazine was quoted as saying, "It is still possible to be disappointed in a game that costs under $15. Most of the games were poorly programmed clones of arcade or console games because they had very small third-party companies such as Bond Treasure, GTC, and Thin Chin Enterprises making games for them. By 1993, Watara saw this and decided to fix the issues. They designed an add-on that would add color to supported games via the TV adapter. They also started securing major third-party licenses with games such as Rambo and Terminator. The system was starting to gain some traction in Asian and European markets, but the writing was on the wall. None of these ideas or games came to production, and it was too little, too late, as the system was discontinued shortly after. In 1993, a Hong Kong investment company called Wellback Holdings launched a new handheld into the ever-growing market. It was called the Megaduck, or also known as the Cougar Boy. Unlike the Supervision or Gamate, the Megaduck didn't want to just imitate the Game Boy, it literally copied it. The Megaduck used the Sharp LR35902 chip, which embeds the Game Boy's hybrid Intel 8080 and Z80 CPU, sound processor, memory controller, and display drivers. Essentially, it's a Game Boy on a chip, making it very easy to port over games. And that brings us to the games. There were a total of 43 games made for the system on 37 cartridges, with 2 carts being 4-in-1s, and most of these were clones of either arcade hits or Nintendo games. Distribution started in Asia and went worldwide except in the United States, but poor sales had plagued the system. Due to too many wannabe Game Boy systems on the market, burning them before, consumers just paid more for the real thing now, instead of buying knockoffs. Also, the Megaduck never really had third-party support. Most of its games were ported clones from the Game Boy that were changed just enough to avoid lawsuits. But people wanted to play the real games, not knockoffs. Sales slumped, and within a couple of years, the system was discontinued, bringing an end to the Megaduck story.
By 1995, Sega was no longer the scrappy challenger that had shocked the gaming industry at the beginning of the decade. For a brief moment in the early 1990s, Sega had accomplished what many thought was impossible. They had challenged Nintendo, and in some markets, they even beat them. The Sega Genesis had become one of the defining consoles of its generation. With aggressive marketing, arcade-style experiences, and the explosive popularity of Sonic the Hedgehog, Sega had transformed itself from an underdog into a serious competitor. The company had built its reputation on doing things differently. When Nintendo zigged, Sega zagged. When competitors played it safe, Sega took risks. And nowhere was that more apparent than their handheld strategy. And unfortunately for Sega, their handheld efforts hadn't exactly gone to plan. Back in 1990, Sega launched the Game Gear as a direct competitor to Nintendo's Game Boy. On paper, the Game Gear looked superior. It featured a full-color backlit screen, more advanced hardware, and graphics that often surpassed Nintendo's aging handheld. But those advantages came with trade-offs. The system was larger, more expensive, and notoriously hungry for batteries. While Game Boy owners often could play for 10 or more hours on a set of batteries, Game Gear owners frequently found themselves searching for replacements only after a few hours of gameplay. Despite selling millions of units worldwide, the Game Gear never seriously threatened Nintendo's dominance. As the years passed, Sega continued searching for a way to break through in the portable gaming market. The answer arrived in October of '95. Known internally during development as Project Venus, the Sega Nomad was unlike any handheld that Sega had put on the market before. At first glance, it looked similar to other portable gaming devices of the era, but beneath the shell, there was something extraordinary. The Nomad wasn't based on the Genesis, it essentially was a Genesis. And because of that, the Nomad could play actual Genesis cartridges. Not special portable versions, not scaled-down adaptations, just the real games. Players could insert Sonic the Hedgehog, Streets of Rage, Shinobi, Phantasy Star 4, or hundreds of other Genesis titles and play them on the go. Today, portable versions of home consoles are common. The Nintendo Switch has built its entire identity around that concept. But in 1995, this was still revolutionary. The idea of carrying a home console library around with you wherever you wanted felt almost futuristic. And for many gamers, it seemed like the ultimate handheld. The Nomad featured a color LCD screen, a 6-button controller layout, stereo sound through headphones, and even something almost unheard of for a handheld system at the time: video output. Using an optional cable, players could connect the Nomad directly to a television and use it almost like a traditional Genesis console. Even more impressive, the system included a second controller port. That meant multiplayer gaming was possible without additional hardware. Think about that for a moment. In 1995, Sega had released a handheld capable of playing Genesis games connecting to a television and supporting multiplayer. This was an astounding piece of engineering, and many retro gaming enthusiasts still consider it one of the most ambitious handhelds to this day. But unfortunately for Sega, ambition and commercial success don't always equal the same thing. One of the Nomad's biggest problems had nothing to do with hardware itself. It was released at exactly the wrong time. By late 1995, Sega was already focused on the future, and they had released the Sega Saturn earlier that year. The company was investing enormous resources into competing with Sony's PlayStation and Nintendo's upcoming Nintendo 64, and as a result, the Nomad often felt like an afterthought. Marketing support was limited, retailers weren't sure how heavily to promote it, and consumers were increasingly looking towards next-generation gaming experiences. The Nomad was asking players to invest in Genesis technology, just as the industry was moving beyond the 16-bit era. To make matters worse, the Genesis itself was beginning to lose momentum. For many gamers, purchasing a portable version of an aging console simply wasn't a priority. Then there was the issue that haunted Sega's handhelds for years: battery life. The Nomad required 6 AA batteries, and depending on the game, those batteries often lasted only just a few hours. This was a familiar problem for Sega. The company's engineers consistently prioritized performance and visual quality over power efficiency. As a result, Sega's handhelds often looked more impressive than Nintendo's hardware, but they were far less practical for long trips. Nintendo's Game Boy continued to dominate because it fit naturally into everyday life. You could throw it into a backpack, take it on a road trip, and expect to keep it working. Commercially, the Nomad was a disappointment. Sales never reached Sega's expectations. The system remained exclusive to North America and never reached a worldwide rollout. Before long, Sega shifted its attention entirely towards other projects. Yet over time, perceptions of the Nomad began to change. As retro gaming enthusiasts rediscovered the system, many came to appreciate just how ambitious it really was. Years before the PSP, years before the Steam Deck, and years before the Nintendo Switch, Sega had attempted to bring true console gaming into portable form factor. In many ways, the Nomad feels less like a product from 1995 and more like a glimpse of handheld gaming's future. At a time when Sega was attempting to put a home console in your pocket, another company was preparing a very different challenge to Nintendo, a company that most gamers already knew. That company was Tiger Electronics, and for many kids growing up in the 80s and 90s, Tiger Electronics was everywhere. Walk into almost any toy store and you'd find their handheld LCD games lining the shelves. Whether it was Double Dragon, Ninja Gaiden, RoboCop, The Little Mermaid, or dozens of other licensed titles, Tiger had built an empire on creating affordable electronic games that could fit in your backpack or jacket pocket. To be fair, these weren't exactly what most people would consider video games today. The screens consisted of pre-drawn LCD segments that simply turned on and off to create the illusion of movement. Characters often jumped between fixed positions rather than moving smoothly across the screen. Yet, despite their limitations, Tiger's handhelds sold incredibly well. They were inexpensive, widely available, and offered kids a portable gaming experience at a time when not everyone could afford a Nintendo Game Boy. And because of this, by the mid-1990s, Tiger Electronics had become a major player in the toy and handheld electronics industry, and the company had bigger ambitions. Rather than producing another LCD game, Tiger wanted to create something that could compete directly with Nintendo's Game Boy. The result would be a system called the GameCom. Released in September of 1997, the GameCom entered a market that Nintendo had largely controlled for nearly a decade. On paper, Tiger's new handheld sounded incredibly impressive. In fact, some of its features wouldn't become common in portable gaming until years later. The most notable feature was its touchscreen. Long before the Nintendo DS popularized touchscreen controls, the GameCom shipped with a restrictive touchscreen and included stylus support. Players could tap icons, navigate menus, and interact with software directly on the screen. But Tiger wasn't finished. The company also envisioned the GameCom as more than just a gaming device. It was marketed as a portable communications platform. Optional accessories allowed users to connect a modem to the handheld. This enabled limited internet access, email functionality, and web browsing. By modern standards, this internet experience was extremely primitive. But remember, this was happening years before smartphones existed, years before wireless internet became common, and years before anyone imagined carrying a connected device in their pocket was going to be an everyday experience. And in some ways, the GameCom was attempting to predict that future. Unfortunately, predicting the future and successfully building it are two very different things. Tiger understood that hardware alone wouldn't sell a new gaming platform. The company needed recognizable software, and surprisingly, they managed to secure some major licenses. The GameCom library included titles based on popular franchises such as Mortal Kombat Trilogy, Duke Nukem 3D, Resident Evil 2, Sonic Jam, Fighters Megamix, and Wheel of Fortune. At first glance, these games looked impressive on the back of the box. Seeing names like Resident Evil and Duke Nukem on a handheld in the late 90s certainly caught people's attention. But once players actually started playing the games, the system's biggest problem suddenly became apparent, and that was the screen. If there was one thing that ultimately doomed the GameCom, it was the display. The monochrome touchscreen suffered from extremely slow refresh rates. The motion blur was just horrible. Fast-moving objects left noticeable trails behind them. Animation often appeared blurry and difficult to follow. Action games became frustrating because players could struggle just to track what was going on the screen. Even titles with impressive concepts felt sluggish and unresponsive. This was especially frustrating because many of the games Tiger was promoting relied on fast-paced gameplay. Fighting games, action games, platformers, all genres that demanded quick visual feedback. The hardware simply couldn't keep up. Reviewers were quick to point out these issues. While many praised the system's ambitious feature set, they also criticized the display and limited software quality. Consumers largely agreed. Despite its innovative ideas, the Gamecom failed to gain significant traction in the marketplace. What's fascinating about the Gamecom today is how many of its ideas would eventually become standard features. The idea of combining gaming with communication features has become commonplace. In many ways, Tiger Electronics identified trends that the rest of the industry would eventually follow. The problem wasn't vision, the problem was execution. The technology simply wasn't ready. The hardware couldn't fully deliver on the promises that Tiger was making, and consumers weren't willing to overlook those shortcomings. Tiger continued supporting the platform for a few more years, releasing additional games and even revised hardware models, but the momentum never materialized. Sales remained disappointing, third-party support was limited, and Nintendo continued to dominate the handheld market. By the turn of the millennium, the Gamecom had effectively disappeared from store shelves. It joined a growing list of handheld systems that had tried and failed to challenge Nintendo's dominance. Yet unlike many of the forgotten gaming platforms, the Gamecom left behind something more than just a cautionary tale. It left behind a collection of ideas that would eventually become mainstream, ideas that millions of people now use every day. Because while the Gamecom may not have been successful, it was surprisingly good at seeing where technology was headed. By the late 1990s, the original Game Boy had already become one of the biggest success stories in gaming history. Released in 1989, Nintendo's little gray handheld had survived challenge after challenge. It had outlasted the technologically superior Atari Lynx, it had survived Sega's colorful and powerful Game Gear, and it had become a cultural phenomenon thanks to games like Tetris, Super Mario Land, and perhaps most importantly, Pokémon. But despite its success, the Game Boy was beginning to show its age. The handheld gaming landscape was changing. Consumers were becoming accustomed to color screens, competing systems were offering more advanced hardware, and even Nintendo knew that the original Game Boy's technology couldn't last forever. The company needed an upgrade. The challenge was figuring out how to modernize the Game Boy without losing everything that made it successful in the first place. One of the biggest reasons Nintendo had dominated the handheld market wasn't because their hardware was the most powerful. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Nintendo had consistently chosen practical hardware over cutting-edge technology. While their competitors focused on color backlit screens and advanced processors, Nintendo focused on affordability, battery life, durability, and software. That strategy had worked remarkably well. So when Nintendo began designing the successor to the Game Boy, they didn't want to start all over. Instead, they wanted to evolve the formula, and the result was the Game Boy Color. Released in October of 1998, the Game Boy Color represented everything Nintendo had learned during the previous decade in handheld gaming. Rather than introducing a completely new platform, Nintendo created a system that felt familiar while addressing many of the original Game Boy limitations. The obvious change was right there in the name, color. At last, Nintendo's handheld players could enjoy games with vibrant visuals instead of the familiar greenish monochrome display that had defined portable gaming throughout the 1990s. For many gamers, this was the upgrade they had been waiting for. Despite its name, the Game Boy Color was more than simply a Game Boy with a colorful screen. Under the hood, Nintendo had made several important improvements. The processor ran much faster than the original Game Boy. Memory was expanded, and developers now had more flexibility when designing the games. And the color display could show dozens of colors from its large color palette. All these improvements allowed developers to create richer, more detailed worlds than ever before on the Game Boy. The games looked brighter, characters appeared more expressive, and the environments finally felt alive in ways that weren't possible on the original hardware. Yet, perhaps the most smart decision that Nintendo made had nothing to do with technology at all. The Game Boy Color remained fully compatible with nearly the entire Game Boy library. This meant players could continue enjoying the games they had already owned. For consumers, it was an easy upgrade. And for Nintendo, it proved a seamless transition between generations. This backward compatibility would prove to be one of the system's greatest strengths. When the system launched in 1998, Pokemon fever was sweeping across the globe. Children were collecting trading cards, watching the animated series, trading monsters on the playground, and spending countless hours exploring Pokemon on their Game Boys. Nintendo couldn't have asked for a better moment to release new hardware. The Game Boy Color immediately benefited from the enormous popularity of the Pokemon franchise. Games like Pokemon Yellow look fantastic on the new system, using enhanced color palettes that breathed new life into familiar adventures. Then came Pokemon Gold and Pokemon Silver. Released in Japan in 1999 and internationally shortly after, these games became some of the most important titles in handheld gaming history. For many players, they were the reason to own a Game Boy Color, and they helped cement Nintendo's dominance for years to come. While Pokemon may be the biggest attraction, it was far from the only reason gamers embraced the Game Boy Color. Nintendo and third-party developers quickly built an impressive software library. Games like The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening DX brought one of Nintendo's greatest adventures to the newest hardware with enhanced visuals. Wario Land 2 and Wario Land 3 showcased creative platforming and clever game design. Titles like Mario Tennis and Mario Golf proved that sports games could thrive on a handheld system. And third-party publishers continue supporting the platform with a wide variety of action, role-playing, puzzle, and licensed games. The Game Boy Color became a destination for players of all ages. Whether you wanted epic adventures, quick arcade-style experiences, or multiplayer competition through the link cable, there was something for everyone. Perhaps most importantly, the system maintained the qualities that had made the original Game Boy so successful. That was affordability, it was durable, and it offered excellent battery life. While competitors often struggled to balance performance and portability, Nintendo continued delivering a handheld that could travel almost anywhere. As the 1990s drew to a close, Nintendo once again found itself in a familiar position, on top. The Game Boy Color quickly became a commercial success. Consumers embraced the new hardware, retailers eagerly stocked it, developers supported it, and competitors found themselves facing the same challenge that existed for nearly a decade. How do you compete with Nintendo? And the answer? As many companies discovered, wasn't that easy, and the Game Boy Color arrived at the perfect time. It offered meaningful improvements over the original Game Boy and not abandoning its roots. It modernized handheld gaming without sacrificing affordability, and this thing delivered exactly what consumers wanted, nothing more and nothing less. Today, the Game Boy Color is remembered as one of Nintendo's most successful handheld systems. It helped bridge the gap between the original Game Boy era and the next generation of portable gaming. It introduced millions of players to some of the greatest handheld games ever created, and it demonstrated a lesson that Nintendo had learned long ago. Sometimes success isn't about having the most powerful hardware. It's about understanding what players actually wanted. The Game Boy Color wasn't the most advanced handheld of its generation. It wasn't the most innovative, and certainly it wasn't the most powerful. But what it did was build off the original Game Boy's success. And that's why it succeeded, where so many others failed. By the late 1990s, Nintendo once again appeared unstoppable in the handheld gaming market. The Game Boy Color was flying off store shelves, Pokemon had become a worldwide phenomenon, and competing handheld manufacturers continued to struggle against Nintendo's dominance. But if there was one company that was not intimidated by Nintendo's success, it was SNK. For arcade gamers, SNK was already a legendary name. The company had spent years building a reputation for fast-paced action games, fighting games, and some of the most impressive arcade games of the era. Titles like Kings of Fighter, Fatal Fury, Samurai Showdown, and Metal Slug had helped establish SNK as one of the biggest names in arcade gaming. And through its arcade-perfect AES Neo-Geo home console, SNK had earned a loyal following amongst dedicated gamers who wanted arcade-perfect experiences at home. Of course, those experiences came at a price, a very expensive price. The Neo-Geo AES was famous for its incredible graphics and arcade-quality games, but its cost placed it well beyond the reach of most players. As the gaming industry evolved, SNK began looking for new opportunities. One of those opportunities was handheld gaming. And unlike some of Nintendo's previous competitors, SNK wasn't interested in simply creating another Game Boy clone. They wanted to bring the Neo-Geo experience to the palm of your hand. In 1998, SNK launched the Neo-Geo Pocket in Japan. At first glance, the system appeared somewhat conservative. Unlike Sega's Game Gear or Atari's Lynx, the original Neo-Geo Pocket featured a monochrome display. This may have seemed like a strange decision during an era when color handhelds were becoming increasingly common, but SNK had learned an important lesson from Nintendo. Battery life mattered. A lot. The Neo-Geo Pocket could deliver excellent battery performance while maintaining affordability and portability. Under the hood, the system featured surprisingly capable hardware. It was designed specifically for gaming rather than trying to serve as a multi-purpose device. And while its black and white screen may have appeared outdated, the system offered smooth gameplay and responsive controls. But there was one feature that immediately stood out: the control stick. Rather than using the traditional D-pad, SNK developed a miniature click stick that provided exceptional precision. Players could feel each directional input physically click into place. For fighting games especially, this design was a revelation. Many fans still consider it one of the finest handheld control mechanisms ever created. Unfortunately, despite its strengths, the original Neo Geo Pocket faced a significant problem. Nintendo had already announced the Game Boy Color, and once color handhelds became the new standard, SNK knew it needed to respond quickly. In 1999, less than a year after the original system's debut, SNK released the Neo Geo Pocket Color. The new model retained everything players loved about the original hardware while adding a vibrant color display. For many gamers, this was the system SNK should have launched from the beginning. The Neo Geo Pocket Color featured a bright screen, excellent battery life, comfortable ergonomics, and the same outstanding click stick controls. It was lightweight, portable, and packed with personality. The hardware itself received praise from critics and players alike. But as we've seen throughout gaming history, great hardware is only part of the equation. The successful handheld also needs great games, and for SNK, that wasn't a problem. If there was one area SNK excelled at, it was software. The company's arcade heritage gave Neo Geo Pocket Color access to some of the most beloved franchises in gaming history. Games like Kings of Fighter Round 2 brought SNK's flagship fighting series to handhelds with impressive results. Samurai Showdown 2 delivered fast-paced weapon-based combat. SNK vs. Capcom Match of the Millennium would eventually become one of the most celebrated handheld fighting games ever released. Meanwhile, games like Metal Slug First Mission and Metal Slug Second Mission successfully translated the chaotic run-and-gun action games of the arcade originals into a portable form. What impressed many players wasn't just the quality of these games, it was how faithfully they captured the spirit of their arcade counterparts. Developers found clever ways to adapt complex arcade experiences to handheld hardware without sacrificing what made those games so fun. The result was a library that felt uniquely SNK. Colorful, fast, stylish, and surprisingly deep. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the Neo Geo Pocket Color might carve out a meaningful niche alongside Nintendo's hardware. Critics praised the system, gamers who owned it loved it, and word of mouth was generally positive. Unfortunately, powerful forces were working against SNK. The Neo Geo Pocket Color's biggest challenge wasn't its hardware, or its games. The biggest problem was its timing. By 1999, Nintendo's handheld ecosystem had become enormous. The Game Boy Color was dominating retail shelves. Pokémon was driving hardware sales to unprecedented levels, and of course, third-party publishers naturally gravitated toward a platform with the largest audience. As a result, many developers simply ignored competing handheld systems. Even a well-designed handheld like the Neo Geo Pocket Color struggled to gain visibility. Consumers walking into stores often saw rows of Game Boy products and only a small selection of Neo Geo Pocket titles. And while dedicated enthusiasts appreciated SNK's efforts, the mainstream audience largely remained focused on Nintendo. Then came another problem. SNK itself was facing financial difficulties. The arcade market was changing, and the company began experiencing serious business challenges. These issues ultimately limited the support and resources available for the Neo Geo Pocket Color. By 2001, the Neo Geo Pocket Color had effectively reached its end of life. Production had ceased and software releases began to slow, and the handheld quietly disappeared from the market. Commercially, it really could never compete with Nintendo's dominance, but unlike many of the failed handheld systems, the Neo Geo Pocket Color left behind an extraordinary legacy. Over the years, retro gamers have rediscovered the platform, collectors seek out its games and fans continue praising its controls. And many players who missed it during its original run have come back to appreciate just how special it really was. In fact, ask a group of retro gamers to name the most underrated handheld of all time, and the Neo-Geo Pocket Color will almost certainly appear near the top of the list. Not because it sold millions of units or changed the industry, but because it delivered an exceptional gaming experience that deserved far more attention than it ever received.
Game over, man. It's game over.